So a question for you, is the church a place for wrestling? Well, what if I told you in February of 2020 at Grace Community United Methodist Church, it was literally a place for wrestling. I don't know about you, but I grew up watching Florida Championship Wrestling in Tampa and with Gordon Solie and Dusty Rhodes and Ric Flair and Harley Race and all these guys. And while we were at Grace Community, Tracy and I, we had a youth director who had a person in the youth group who had graduated from this local school and was studying to be an EMT in Jacksonville, but he was also on the side, he was training to be a professional wrestler. And so for several years, this youth director had been talking to us, we've been asked to host this event, and we could host this event here, and we kind of kept putting it off and putting it off and putting it off. But in the end of 2019 and beginning of 2020, we were trying all kinds of new things, new fresh expression ideas to connect with the neighborhood. Our mission at Grace was creating a community where everyone can experience God's transforming grace. And so we were trying to figure out a way, how do we reach more of our community? Maybe some community that might be different from us. And so finally we said, okay, well, let's do this thing. Let's try something way out of the box. Now, Grace Community, we had one building, okay? In our sanctuary was also the gymnasium, was also the fellowship hall, was also a wiffle ball field when we needed to play wiffle ball. And so it was multi-purpose. And we hosted what was called Continental Championship Wrestling. It was a kind of a small time of what you see. It's not the same as what you see on TV, but it was a training ground for people. And we hosted this, and we got, let's say, we got some feedback. How about that? And you can see some of these guys here, and this is the ring. Go ahead. This is the ring set up in our sanctuary there. It's a lot bigger than it seems, and it was a fun night. And I'll tell you, we had several hundred people come out that had never stepped foot on our campus. And now this was right before the pandemic, so we never hosted one again yet. But it was an interesting thing. And we got feedback, right, from, oh, this is a terrible idea. How dare you defame God's house of worship? And these are all from people pretty much outside of our church, and they couldn't believe what we were doing. And we were the talk of the little town at times. And then other people would be like, this is so amazing. I can't believe a church is doing this. This is so cool that the church would welcome people like me. So I guess my question is it okay to wrestle in church? Our story today is about wrestling. Not professional wrestling, but it starts out, we see Jacob on the banks of the Jabbok River. It's on the other side of the Jordan, out of Israel, and he's sitting there and he's waiting to go see his brother Esau. But let's flash back to how we got here. We've skipped a lot of stuff, and we had Isaac that was born, and then Isaac lived, and Isaac had a son named Jacob. And Jacob was born with his twin brother Esau. And Esau was the firstborn, but Jacob was grabbing at his heel in the womb as he left, trying to hold him back and trying to pull himself to be the number one son. And then they had some adversity growing up, and Jacob, whose name means grabs the heel or swindler or cheater, he was constantly kind of scheming around. He was a little bit of a scoundrel. And he was always scheming for something, and so he decided one day, with the help of his mother, that he was going to ask his father for a blessing, but not the blessing that was to him. He wanted Esau's blessing as the firstborn son. So he went to his father, and he was in disguise as his brother Esau and received this blessing. And Esau was so upset that he wanted to kill his brother. And so his father Isaac sent him away to live with his uncle Laban in his home country. And on his way there, he had an encounter with God. You might remember this one called Jacob's Ladder, and he saw the angels coming up and down the ladder to heaven. And God promised him that he would protect him. Even outside of where he was by himself, traveling with just his staff, that he would protect him. And then he made a promise. He said, your family will be like the grains of sand on the banks of the ocean. Similar to the promise that he gave to his grandfather, Abraham. And he remembered God's promise. And he lived a good life with Laban. He ended up marrying not one of Laban's daughters, but two of Laban's daughters, because Laban was also a scoundrel and a schemer. You know, that's the biblical family values of two wives this time, right? So Laban kind of changes, and Jacob begins to fear Laban, and he returns home. He returns to what he knows, the familiar. He's missing his family, but he is frightened. He is afraid to face his brother Esau. And so he begins with prayer, which is great. He begins with prayer, and he reaches out to God, and he says, Lord, you told me, you promised me all these things, that I would be a great nation, and I would have generations numbering the sands of the sands of the beach, and I'm not worthy for that. But you've taken care of me. And he said, now I'm very afraid. Save me from my brother Esau, because you told me you would take care of me. So Esau is there praying, and then he begins this journey to go see his brother. And he prepares a gift of all that he has, and he divides it into two gifts of all kinds of his cattle and his sheep and his oxen and everything he has. He sends it ahead of him in two different groups. And he sleeps on the edge of the Jabbok River. And in the middle of the night, he's visited by a man. We're not exactly told what this man is. Some people in history have thought this was God or an angel or a demon or maybe Esau. Or maybe psychologically, maybe Jacob is wrestling with himself in his inner self. We don't know exactly. At the end, Jacob does say that, and he names that place Peniel, which means I've seen God face to face. So we can surmise that Jacob is wrestling with some kind of divine figure. And he wrestles with this man, and Jacob won't let go. And he wants to be blessed, and he's grabbing and holding on, and then finally the man says, let me go. And Jacob says, not until you bless me. And so the man blesses him, and he says, now your name will be Israel, which means one who strives with God, one who wrestles with God. You see, in Scripture, when we get a name change, it implies a change of character or a change of life circumstances or a change of status. And Jacob goes from being the one who is grabbing at the heel and one who is the swindler and the cheater and the scoundrel to one who has wrestled with God and man and won. You see, Jacob's life was filled with struggle. Filled with wrestling. He wrestled with his brother in the womb and then outside the womb. He had struggles with his father. He had struggles with his father-in-law and uncle Laban. And then he has struggles in wrestling with God. And if I was honest with you this week, and I'm always honest with you, but just sharing my honest reaction with Jacob, I was having some hard time finding a virtuous thing in Jacob's life to share with you today. But here's 4 things I want to share with you about Jacob's life. The first one, I think, he reaches out and he remembers God's promises. He remembers the promise that he made that his family would be as many as the grains of sand. And he remembers that. And he expresses gratitude. He says, God, I'm not worthy for this promise, but you made it. So please take care of me. And he says, I'm afraid. Save me from my brother, because you told me this. You promised me this. And it's an interesting thing. At the beginning of that prayer, he says, the God of my grandfather Abraham, the God of my father Isaac. He doesn't say my God yet. He's not quite ready to acknowledge God as his God. But he's seen what God has done for his grandfather and for his father. But at the end, he says, if you do this, you guys ever do those? You ever hedge your prayers? If you do this, God. We've ever been doing something, we've found trying to find acceptance and love in certain places that are wrong maybe, and we've said, God, if you do this, I will never, ever do this again. Don't raise your hands if you've ever prayed that prayer. We probably all have at certain times. So Jacob prays this prayer, says, if you do this, God, you will be my God. And then Jacob is also, secondly, he's persistent. He doesn't give up. He holds on to this figure, this God figure, and won't let go. He's desperate for some kind of blessing, some kind of change in his life, even if he doesn't know exactly what that is. Sort of like the persistent widow in the Gospels who keeps coming and coming and coming. And finally the judge says, let her have her way. Jacob is persistent and won't let go. And the man of God seems to have to ask him, almost beg him to let me go because dawn is breaking. The third thing that I like about Jacob in this story is that he brings his authentic self. This story is not all cleaned up for us. We kind of still see Jacob as this swindler and schemer and cheater and scoundrel. He's if we're talking in wrestling terms, he's kind of like the heel, right? In wrestling, there's the heel, the bad guy, and there's a baby face, which is the good guy. And right now we see Jacob, and Jacob is kind of like the bad guy. He's on the dark side. But he starts where he is. That's who he is. That's what he knows. And God accepts Jacob's authentic self. Esau is the baby face. He's the one that we all feel a little bit sorry for because Jacob stole his blessing. But we start where we are and we bring our authentic selves, and that's what Jacob did. He came from a major dysfunctional family. And he hedges his bets with God and with Esau. He hedges his bet with God, like, God, if you do this, then I will call you my God. And then he gets this gift, right? He gives this gift to Esau. He's hedging his prayer to God. Just in case God doesn't come through, I'll bring a gift for my brother Esau. And the interesting thing is when it says gift in the scriptures there, that word is the same word used for blessing that he stole from his brother Esau. Barakah. It's the same word used in blessing that's passed down to children. And so at worst, Jacob is giving a bribe to his brother Esau. At best, he's returning this blessing that he stole. The truth is probably somewhere in the middle, as it usually is. So he hedges his bets with God, he hedges his bets with Esau, and then his life and his family continues to live in dysfunction. He continues some of the same things that he experienced. His mother, who played him as the favorite and helped him to steal Esau's blessing, well, Jacob plays favorites too. He ends up having the favorite son of Joseph, right, with the coat of many colors, and the favorite son, Benjamin, who was the youngest, who was the baby of the family. And he continues to live into this dysfunction. And in spite of all this, in spite of all of Jacob's terrible behaviors and continuing on, God still uses Jacob. It's because of this fourth thing that I think we can learn from Jacob is that perfection that God calls us to, not to be without fault, not to never do a bad thing again, but perfection is learning to love as God loves. Loving people with the intent of love. We learn that perfection is a process more often than not. Could God make us perfect immediately? Absolutely. Does God often do that? Not so much. It's more of a process where we stay close to God, and as we talked about a couple weeks ago, we are molded and shaped by God. And it's a process toward perfection. And we ebb and flow in and out of being, maybe being a baby face and maybe being a heel, following God and not following God so much. It's never always up and to the right. It's kind of up and down, up, down, and up. My watch is talking to me. It's 3 steps forward and 2 steps back. And yet, if we think about that and do some math, that's still 1 step forward. It's never a straight line. That night before our wrestling match, or in the middle of the wrestling match, our youth director, Greg Rush, he got in the ring before the second half of the events. And he began to welcome everyone back and was saying that we had hosted this to make our campus available for community activities. And he said, I'm so excited that you are here tonight for this wrestling match. And did you know it's okay to wrestle with God? And he told them the story of Jacob. And then he said, this church, is a place where we can come and wrestle with God and with our faith. We can wrestle with our disbelief and our fear. We can wrestle with our anxiety and our anger. So this church is a place where you don't have to have it all figured out. And I'm so glad you're here tonight. And I'm not sure there's any better words to demonstrate what a church should be. It should be a safe place for us to come together and to wrestle and to struggle with our faith and struggle and wrestle with the Scriptures. And we're reminded throughout the Psalms that it's okay to express our disappointment with God. It's okay to express our disbelief and our anger and our sadness. God is not intimidated by those feelings. I'd like to tell you that Jacob is completely changed when his name gets changed. But Jacob kind of continues to ebb and flow. He continues to struggle. And even though when he goes to finally see Esau, where it's kind of like a picture of the prodigal son, and Jacob is there, and Esau runs to him and embraces him. And he says, I have seen the face of God in my brother Jacob. He can see that Jacob has had an encounter with God, and his face is still shining that light. But Jacob continues to struggle. He continues to hedge his bets with God. He continues to make backroom deals. He continues to perpetuate the family dysfunction. But our lives are similar to Jacob's at times. It's not always a simple move up and to the right of perfection. It's a windy road. At our best, our lives are a message of God's love, and at our worst, we spend time making backroom deals and hedging our bets and prayers with God and relying on the strength of ourselves and pulling ourselves up by our bootstraps, just in case God doesn't come through. Or maybe at times without even consulting God first. Sometimes we're that baby face, and sometimes we're the heel. Sometimes we're the saints, and sometimes we're the sinners. Mary Oliver is a poet who my wife is very fond of, and she shared this poem with me, which I think can help us know how maybe we can talk to God. She says about prayer and praying, it doesn't have to be the blue iris. It could be weeds in a vacant lot or a few small stones. Just pay attention and then patch. A few words together, and don't try to make them elaborate. This isn't a contest, but a doorway into thanks and a silence in which another voice may speak. Our prayers don't have to be nice and pretty and clean. We can come to God with all of our feelings, all of our thoughts, all of our whatevers of our life. God knows it already. It doesn't have to be fancy. It doesn't have to be all perfect. So is the church a place for wrestling? I think the church is the perfect squared circle to wrestle with our faith and with others, with God, and with ourselves. Amen?
Amen.